Greetings, friends of liberty. I'm often reminded how, here in the late 18th century, when I visit the estate gardens of my English friends, how our style of landscape gardening with its pond or lake, open lawns and groves of trees are now, not surprisingly, being imitated by the French. Can you imagine the boring formality of their square garden beds, their crunchy and noisy gravel paths, and the innumerable and insufferable boxwoods, all pruned to all manner of eccentric form, that typically the gardens in Louis XIV's Versailles represented? What a ghastly and artificial formality, so typical sometimes of the Frenchies. Our superb English cottage gardens are themselves immeasurably superior in their synchronicity and harmony, and revealing the beauty of nature and the English countryside. However, speaking now of your 21st century in North America, and a noted disharmony now found in nature, we have here in this book Nature Wars, the incredible story of how wildlife comebacks turned playgrounds into battlegrounds, with author Jim Sterba chronicling the vast reforestation of regions of America that has occurred in the last 150 years, and with it, the subsequent problems and conflicts created. Sterba, author previously of Frankie's Place, a love story, a book about how he fell in love with a Maine summer cottage on Mount Desert Isle and the woman who owned it, begins here by describing his home in Poughkeepsie, New York, and the extraordinary amount of wild creatures that he can potentially encounter on a daily walk. Crows, vultures, raccoons, turkeys, herons, rafts of waterfowl, foxes, coyotes, opossums, skunks, woodchucks, squirrels, rabbits, chipmunks, owls, woodpeckers, beavers, turtles, muskrats, otters, weasels, fishers, bobcats, and black bears. And of course, deer, destroying with their overpopulation both valuable landscape shrubbery and the underbrush of forests and spreading Lyme disease wherever they wander, the author himself having contracted it 3 times over a 12-year period. As Sterba says, it is very likely that more people live in closer proximity to more wild animals and birds in the eastern United States today than anywhere on the planet at any time in history. Having finished describing the range of personal wildlife encounters available to many modern suburbanites, he debunks a number of misconceptions about forests and ecology, these myths being part of the current ideology and self-deceptions of modern environmentalism. A, the idea that the natural world is peaceful and benign, not the brutal Darwinian struggle for survival it really is. B, the idea that wildlife is still scarce, while the reality actually now being, for example, that there are estimated to be as many white-tailed deer in America, 30 million, as there were when the Pilgrims landed. C, the fact that people often approach wild animals as pets, ignoring their wild nature, a notable example here being the case of Timothy Treadwell in Alaska, who befriended grizzlies, with the result that one evening the grizzly called the Machine made a feast of both him and his girlfriend. D, how people east of the Mississippi think of the forests as being somewhere out west or in Canada without realizing that the whole Northeast, apart from the strictly urban areas, the whole Northeast is now basically one huge forest, this centuries-long reforestation only being equaled historically perhaps by the vast reforestation that occurred when the entire Mayan civilization collapsed. E, how people instead think constantly, deceived by the media, that forests throughout the country are constantly shrinking, when the reality is they're larger than ever before, and that partly because of global warming and the increased CO2 in the air, the whole world is greening, and that many forests, using all that airborne CO2 plant fertilizer, are becoming greener and larger. F, how people often think that when the Pilgrims arrived, the forest stretched so thoroughly from the Atlantic to the Mississippi that a squirrel, at least theoretically, could have sprung through the treetops from Plymouth, Massachusetts to what is now Memphis, Tennessee, without ever touching one of his little paws to the ground, when the reality was, in the East and throughout the country, Indians burned the forest to provide better and more diverse habitat for the wildlife which they hunted and to facilitate their own slash-and-burn agriculture, which meant that our little squirrel would have had to endanger his life constantly in his journey west by running as fast as his little legs would carry him across miles of open ground. So how exactly did this vast reforestation of especially Eastern America occur? Essentially because American agriculture became enormously more productive over time, with the result that whereas in 1800 approximately 90% of Americans farmed, today only 1% do, with American farmers now not only feeding 332 million Americans, as opposed to the 5 million Americans who existed in 1800, but also many millions around the world. And this increased agricultural productivity was all caused by the increased use of fertilizers, by the much more productive seed stock developed, by the advent of tractors and the ubiquitous use of farm machinery, and the modern transportation network with its ability to send quickly and cheaply oranges from Florida and grapes from California to all parts of the country. All this means also a decrease in the amount of land farmed, with all that extra land now being released for other uses. As Sterba says, in 1990, farmers grew 5 times more food per acre than farmers in 1930 had grown, and they farmed fewer acres. Much of New England, for example, used to be open farm country, but once more productive areas in the Middle West, California, and the South were utilized, most of commercial farming in New England disappeared, except for cranberries, blueberries, apples, and some turkey and dairy farms. What farmer really wanted to wrestle with the relatively rocky, hilly, infertile soil of New England? Unless, that is, you're feeding the locavores who don't mind paying extra. Secondly, at least until recently, when the Forest Service has allowed huge buildups of fuel loads in national parks and forests, the frequency of forest fires was declining from earlier times. Thirdly, forests also increased in part during colonial times because beavers used to cut down lots of trees, but these were gone in the East early before 1776. All this meant that, even before the Civil War, the process of reforestation in New England had begun in earnest. Sterba next proceeds to describe the various aspects and responses of both wildlife and people to the simple fact of this enormously increased forest located in the vast sprawl of modern America. Number 1, how the dumpster was invented, which allowed some animals like raccoons and bears to scrounge for food. Number 2, how beavers have returned to cut down trees and flood suburban and rural backyards. Number 3, how the decrease of trapping and hunting animals as a hobby has led to less and more costly animal control right when more animal control was needed. Number 4, the increasing growth of lobbying groups like the Humane Society, which often oppose the reasonable culling of nuisance animals and also oppose animal traps, even ironically humane traps that kill instantly. Number 5, how even with deer hunting as popular as it still is, the number of deer killed are nowhere near enough to keep the herd populations at reasonable levels, and how in some places, far from the 12 deer per square mile that is optimal, there are 60 to 100 per square mile. Number 6, how perhaps 500,000 people per year in the U.S. are getting Lyme disease, largely because of the inability to control deer populations. Number 7, how the fact that Massachusetts has passed laws prohibiting firing a weapon within 150 feet of a road and 500 of a dwelling, which renders, by one estimate, 60% of the state's 5.2 million acres off limits for hunting, thus creating a large Lyme disease danger zone. Number 8, how the buck law, which outlaws the killing of does by hunters, is implicated in the overpopulation. Number 9, how deer hunts now are often protested by groups like Citizens to End Animal Suffering and Exploitation, one of whom said after a deer hunt that, "I lost 576 of my closest friends there." Number 10, how people on both sides of the deer killing issue become agitated, so much so that town councils and selectmen become afraid to make any decisions at all. Number 11, how Canada geese, with their large and ever-growing populations and ability to foul public places, are creating the same kind of divisions among communities, with the geese lovers sending hate mail to animal control specialists and talking of a goose holocaust whenever goose population is reduced. Number 12, how, however, once geese started getting ingested into jets, engines, with planes crashing and people dying, the Goose Rights Brigade now found themselves on the back foot. 13, how the same kind of drama is even playing out to a greater degree with the increasing feral cat population, estimated at 50 to 100 million, with those tasked with killing the cats facing death threats, and one exterminator saying, "The screamers I can handle, it's the quiet ones you have to watch." Number 14, how, of course, the same pattern of near extinction, then rebound, happened with turkeys, who become so plentiful in some areas that pedestrians use umbrellas or letter carriers' brooms to ward them off. Number 14, how bird feeding has become enormously popular over the last half-century, with some of the first feeders made in New England by the Droll Yankee Company. And finally, 15, I would note here myself that he makes no mention of the large and troublesome feral pig population, now estimated at 6 million in the U.S. and causing likely over 100 million in crop damage yearly. So how does Sterba do with this subject? I give him a BB+. He kept me engaged throughout, with an ability to weave personal insights and individual excerpts into an engrossing and informative narrative. The only real problem, such that it is, with this book is that it's the work of a good journalist, but not that of a free market environmentalist who would understand the value and necessity of respecting individual property rights in optimizing the use of nature, natural resources, and wildlife. You can find such an approach with individual economists such as Randall O'Toole and Gary Leibkap at Reason magazine and at think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. With that said, allow me the following observations. Number 1, when discussing the history of timber use in America, he seems to imply or at times suggest what has been called the depletion theory. In other words, America is rapidly destroying its forests with clear-cutting and wanton use of timber, and that only the creation of national parks by Teddy Roosevelt and other progressive reformers saved those forests from the greedy robber barons of the 19th century. This idea, incidentally, is similar to the one that liberals have constantly spread about peak oil, that we're constantly at threat of running out of oil reserves. The reality, however, as Sherry Olson described in her book The Depletion Myth, is quite different. The railroads, which have been the main users of forest products for cross ties, posts, and bridge supports, started looking for alternative ways to deal with a slight shortage, indicated by a rise in prices as soon as it started. How did they do this? By developing creosote and other preservatives, which made ties last much longer, by using metal braces at stress points, by developing new ways of seasoning wood which made it tougher and last longer, and by the expansion after the Civil War of transportation networks which let railroads use more local, cheap sources of timber. Number 2, the most important general rule to resolving these conflicts is to simply recognize that wild animals are the property of the persons on whose property they are. Legal recognition of that natural fact would let homeowners, neighborhood associations, and others kill nuisance animals in the most efficient and humane way possible, usually by weapons or trapping. What that would mean overall is that cat lovers would feed feral cats on their property, and those who found them a nuisance would kill them or find others to kill them on their property. Same with deer, with feral pigs, with turkeys, with beavers, and with the skunks that tear up the lawn. Each individual homeowner should be able to do what he wants on his property. What Sterba importantly misses is that while forests have regrown, America is now much less respecting of individual property rights than it was before, and this has resulted in Americans no longer being able to control the animals that can create such nuisance and danger. So it's not just that the forests have grown back, but that America has changed politically since. Number 3, the second most important rule to understand is that when the state mandates the treatment of wild animals, this is always an inferior solution to what a true private sector and civil society can offer. A typical example here is the Endangered Species Act, which half destroyed the lumber industry in parts of the Northwest due to trying to save the spotted owl, which attempt first was based on bad science, and secondly which, given the huge fires now caused by bad Forest Service management of forests, was irrelevant anyway, since some of that habitat was destroyed subsequently by their million-acre fires. Finally, another great way to save animals and nature, as this whole book demonstrates, is simply to let a free, capitalistic society do what it does best, to progressively increase our abilities to satisfy our needs without using animals to satisfy them. A famous example here is how John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil actually saved the whales by developing the whole petroleum industry, meaning that no one wanted whale oil anymore, so they stopped killing whales. Similarly, if you want to save songbirds from poor people catching and eating them, as Sterba describes happening earlier, just allow a free society, for example, to make the production of chicken cheaper, which has actually occurred with the price of a chicken per hour dropping from 2.5 hours worked in 1900 to 15 minutes worked in the year 2000. How many hillbillies in the wilds of Appalachia will really find it worthwhile to catch robins for a late-night snack now? On that note of happiness, that I can return via Doctor Who's TARDIS to 18th century England at any time to consume a deliciously roasted thrush or skylark, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.